In Mark chapter 12, Jesus is once again faced with the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the scribes. And while he begins preaching in the Jewish temple towards the end of his ministry, he comments regarding the scribes in verse 38, "Beware the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted in the marketplace. Such accusations are being levied at the leadership of the Unification Church, that they are engaged in bribery, embezzlement, and even gambling, including the founder of the Unification Church, the wife of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, Dr. Hak Jahan Moon." Now, while such accusations are flaunted with inaccuracies in reporting, journalistic bias, and especially inhumane treatment of one of the accused, Hak Jahan Moon herself, who is inhumanely being detained in a small jail cell with no wheelchair and no cane, despite blindness and heart problems, it brings up a larger question of, is the Unification Church the exception to the rule or the norm with regard to religious institutions? And it is my view that it is, unfortunately, the latter, that the Unification Church is indeed an institution made up of imperfect human beings who are doing their best to put their faith in God and those who they believe God has sent to complete his will. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you're new, please like the video and subscribe to the channel and check out my other content that has been published recently, especially my conversation with an anti-cult apologist, which you can find in the description below. So, we are going to react to an English dub of MBC's documentary about the Unification Church and how, while it has practices and ideals, falls short. But unfortunately, MBC does not make that conclusion. Instead, it makes the conclusion that all of its practices, all of its ideals are executed in a way that is evil and needs to be stopped, concluding with the total disintegration of the Unification Church and the lockup of Hak Jahan Moon herself in detainment without a fair trial. Let's begin.
You have to bless your ancestral members. You have to rush towards your goal in the shortest possible time. Do you understand? In the beginning, there were a few donations of 700,000 won, and after that, there was a donation of 50,000 won each for ancestors up to 400 generations. So there was a donation system that said that in order to send ancestors from hell successfully, they had to donate.
Okay, so MBC talks about the Unification Church practice of ancestor liberation, which, if you watched my full reaction to this documentary, I explain very clearly what ancestor liberation is, and I will do so now briefly. Ancestor liberation, which is rooted in traditional East Asian tradition, as well as a concept that is known throughout other cultures, such as African cultures, a practice where believers on earth are seeking to connect to their ancestors in the spiritual realm, something very common throughout many religious faiths. Perhaps not Christianity, perhaps not the West, but in the East and in places such as Africa, very common. And the way the Unification Church expresses this practice is through a process called ancestor liberation. Because in Unification Church theology, every single human being requires restoration. And because growth of the spirit can only be done on the earth, through love on the earth, through something called vitality elements, spirits cannot grow solely in the spirit realm. They must come back down to earth in order to receive that growth, that spiritual nourishment to grow. And it is that growth, especially through love, that determines someone's voluntary admission into heaven or hell. In other words, the Unification Church does not believe that anyone is sentenced to hell, something MBC seems to claim through its explanation of ancestor liberation and other practices that is said in Unification Church circles. That is not Unification Church theology. Now, ancestor liberation is when you offer a condition, which in Unification Church terms requires three things: the central figure, you or I, the object for the condition, which is either faith or something substituting it that is valuable, for example, in the Old Testament, an animal sacrifice, and in our time, money, the most valuable currency that determines wealth and what you can and cannot have, physically speaking, and a time period, often based on biblical numbers. And conditions are made in many aspects of unificationist lives, including in ways to connect to the ancestors. So when this girl, this woman, is describing this process of ancestor liberation and donations, it is part of a sacred practice in the Unification Church, establishing conditions to grow yourself or contribute to the growth, spiritually speaking, of others. Now let's recall Matthew chapter 12, verse 38, where Jesus is wary of those who flaunt themselves. And later in this chapter, he points to a woman who is in poverty, donates something really small. And Jesus says, this woman has donated more than anyone else in the temple, any of the scribes, anything that the Pharisees have offered. And this is where the Unification Church, as have many religious institutions in the past, falls short. It falls short. The donation amounts are way too much, in my opinion. And any forcing or coercion for Unification Church members to engage in this practice, even though they are facing economic hardship, and as NBC talks about with this interview with this woman, leads to some families not even be able to clothe their children. Such attempts at getting believers to engage in this practice is wrong, and it is against Jesus' teachings, which, by the way, Unificationism strongly believes in. It believes in the Bible. It believes in Jesus' teachings. And if the Unification Church is engaging in this kind of way of encouraging believers to do this sacred practice, then that is wrong. That is wrong. And if members are being asked to spend hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, even though they are in poverty, my response is go to Jesus' teachings and go to Unification Church theology, which talks about how conditions are about the heart in which it is offered, not fully based upon the actual thing itself. And divine principle, the core text of Unificationism, gives the example of Cain and Abel, and how while Cain wasn't offering the sacrifice in a manner acceptable to God, the real issue was his heart of jealousy that he had to overcome. Divine principle makes that very clear. Another example is a condition Moses sets by killing an Egyptian taskmaster. While Father Moon in later speeches describes how this was not the ideal way Moses should establish a condition for the Israelites to follow him and fulfill the will of God, it was still a good condition in the eyes of God because of Moses' heart towards God's people, towards God's will. And the Egyptians, in that Cain-type position, in an enemy position, made that condition a just one. And that's what we forget. That's what this documentary misses. The ideal, the theological richness of what conditions really are, while at the same time highlighting that, yes, the condition is being dumbed down, spiritually speaking, by certain leaders, unnamed leaders. They don't really give names on who coerced this woman to do this and her family to do this. But those who are doing that are devaluing this sacred part of Unificationism.
The Unification Church, which believes that the donations sent by the association are a continuous donation from its members. One of the core doctrines of the Unification Church is the so-called restoration of all things. All nations, religions, wealth, and all things must return to the Unification Church. In other words, they must be restored.
All things must be restored.
Alright, so NBC once again is just reporting without any theological context. Restoration of all things, yes, is a key idea in Unification Church theology. However, whether it's a mistranslation in the dub or it's actually said in Korean, the doctrine, the theology of Unificationism does not say restore all things to the Unification Church. It clearly says restore all things to God, a common Judeo-Christian theme, bringing everything into the dominion and light of God and light of Christ if you're a Christian, and even a Unificationist. The light of God, the dominion of God, not the Unification Church. That is a total lie that the English dub has just given us.
Based on the accounting documents we obtained, the total budget for the Cheonwon Palace project is estimated at approximately 920 billion won. As of 2023, the estimated execution amount is approximately 710 billion won. Of this, the budget allocated for the exhibition hall dedicated to the founder's life is estimated at approximately 113.1 billion won.
Alright, now we get into the donations used to build the newest Unification Church building, the Cheonwon-gun Cheonil Sanctum Temple. Now, first of all, in Unificationism, as with religions throughout the world, temples are very important. It was important for the Jewish faith. Fancy and innate, enormous buildings were very important for Christianity. And why? Because they served a sacred purpose to connect believers with the divine in a substantial way. For Unificationists, to connect with God as a heavenly parent in a real way. Now, that's the ideal. That's the teachings. That's the aim that Unificationists and the theology itself strives for. Now, does that mean that every single manner in which the Unification Church itself, the church, the institution, carries out that aim is perfect? No. If there is coercive solicitation of donations, if there is excessive asks of donations despite clear knowledge that Unification Church members are facing economic hardship, then such ways in fulfilling this aim are not justified and are wrong, and they should be called out. However, MBC treats the entire temple, the entire faith practice, the entire theology as something to be scorned at, as something to mock at, as something to say is a pseudo-religion or a fake religion. That is such a clueless conclusion that doesn't take into account any of the actual Unification Church teachings. It equates the Unification Church teachings with the institution itself. And that equation doesn't work. Institutions are made up of imperfect human beings who are striving to a divine aim. As with every single religion, Christianity has fallen short. Look at the indulgence scandals of the Catholic Church. Look at the priest abuse scandals of the Catholic Church. Look at Protestant churches with selling blessings and selling this and selling that. Look at the Jewish faith at the time of Jesus Christ, who he repeatedly calls out as being hypocritical, as not valuing the donations of the poor, not even caring for the poor. And yet, they all had aims. Each religion had an aim. Each and every one. And it was an aim that human beings have been incapable to attain. And that's the point. It's supposed to be a divine aim. An aim that we continue striving upwards on Jacob's ladder for. And what is the Unificationist ideal? It strives for total unity with God as a heavenly parent through ideal families. Family salvation, world peace, cosmic peace. Restoring each and every single individual, not the rapture where only 144,000 are saved, not where the elect are saved. The ideal and aim of Unificationism is that every single living and spiritual person is within the dominion of God's love. Reverend and Mrs. Moon are two people who they felt, and you can't really argue that they felt this because, for example, Reverend Moon, 3-hour sleep schedule, world tours at over 90 years of age with health risks involved. Same with Hak Jahan Moon in her late 70s as well, 5 years ago. World tours at the risk of health, 3-hour-a-day sleep schedules, enduring labor camps by communists in North Korea, visiting enemies like Kim Il-sung and Mikhail Gorbachev, who advocated for communism, which they vehemently opposed. All these pieces of evidence, their words themselves, which MBC takes small little clips of and mistranslates in the English dub or misconcludes in the English dub. It is unbelievable what is being ignored about the feeling that these two people genuinely felt, that they genuinely felt they were called by God to pursue this ideal, this mission. And as I said in the beginning of the video, people of faith put their faith in those who they have faith that God is working through. It's a matter of faith. Did Reverend and Mrs. Moon actually achieve their mission? That's up for discussion only because it can't be proven. It's a matter of faith. And the faith of Unificationists is being challenged and being levied as a pseudo and fake religion with practices solely for the purpose of soliciting mass sums of money to what? for the leaders to be corrupt, clearly there is corruption in the Unification Church. And the light needs to be cast on that deep, dark shadow. And at the same time, the faith of unificationists should be allowed to continue freely, because unificationists are part of a religious institution. And religious institutions, full stop, no questions about it, are imperfect. Which is why the true focus should be on the ideal. In fact, even Reverend Moon said multiple times he did not want to build a church. He wanted to abolish religion. Why? Because he wanted to solely focus on the aim, the upward aim, the ideal, which, in my opinion, is one of the highest I've ever seen in theology, in religion, in philosophy. And that is something I believe is worth following.
They
say the Unification Church has been releasing new products since President Han Hak-ya took power. Yun bought a Hyojongwon, a Buddhist temple, for 4 million won, which is said to appease the ancestors' wishes.
Think of indulgences. In an imperfect institution, an imperfect practice developed. Now, is the actual act of donating money to a higher cause wrong? No. It's the way that it's done. It's the way the ideal is fulfilled. That's what I'm trying to get across in this video. And this is my message to those who call the Unification Church a cult. It's not a cult. It's a religion and an institution that is imperfect. The institution is imperfect, and it's time to recognize that, while at the same time, yes, calling out its corruption, which is long overdue. Certain leaders in the Unification Church are misusing donations. The way that donations are solicited needs to stop, and it needs to change. The amount that is requested for ancestor liberation should be lowered, reflecting on Jesus in Mark chapter 12. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't throw out the miraculous theology and ideas that are expressed in works like The Divine Principle, in Reverend Moon's speeches and Mrs. Moon's speeches. Don't throw that out. Look to improve upon it. Look to do better, be better. Just as the Christian church seeks to do, and the Jewish faith seeks to do, and all manner of religious institutions seek to do. They seek to get better. And this is an opportunity for the Unification Church to do better, to improve. And I believe that it can. And I believe that the truth will be revealed, as Mrs. Moon put it. The truth will be revealed, and there will be improvement, and we, and I at least, will continue on the aim that Unificationism has set out for me. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you agree or disagree with anything I said in this video, please put it in the comments below, and I will engage with you. I love the discussion. I love especially the disagreement, and I want to hear from you, whether you're a Christian, a member of the Unification Church, a member of other churches like Sincheonji Church or World Mission Society Church, one of the other groups in Korea that is being deemed a cult. Let's focus on the merits of its ideas, of its theology, of its aim, of its ideal, before then acknowledging and shining the light on the corruption. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.